class or one-on-one instruction or something?
No, it still has to have that instructional element to it. But I can.
It would be like a recital. Or
Yes, where no charge, exactly.
Okay, so an exhibition.
It could be an exhibition, but with no commercial ability to make money for the entities participating or something. I don't know.
I'm just going to say the original ordinance was written to stop those fight club fights that were happening around the city, and people didn't pay to go. They just showed up at a location, and two people fought, and a lot of times the person was left broken and bleeding on the pavement, and they ran. And it was a real concern for our city for safety, and so that's why they ended up putting a lot of those rules in place. That you have to have headgear, you had to have bathroom facilities, you have to have medical person, a doctor on site to prevent those fight club fights from happening just anywhere in the city. And I think if you don't, I don't know that the not charging is going to take care of that, because there is a disturbing trend right now, disturbing to me, among high school students that's starting up now. These fight clubs are happening in Utah County. They are happening, and I don't know if you could say that it's MMA, but that's kind of what it seems where it's coming from. And we spend so much money and so many resources in school, anti-bullying, anti-fighting, and getting kids to not do those things. And now with this trend, they're cropping up again. And so I think if the direction that we're going is to stop these fights from happening, then we need to either put more teeth in our ordinance, or we need to be, I don't know. That's kind of my concern, and I think if we are relaxing the ordinance saying that can happen if you don't charge, well, they're not charging, they're meeting at someone's house. And I know this because they're coming away with broken bones or concussion, and I know of 3 incidences where this has occurred, and I just think it's a disturbing trend. It's a disturbing message to send to our youth that it's okay as long as you don't pay to go, or it's okay to, and I know that's not your intention,
No,
but it's
it
an
would be in the
unintended
gym.
consequence.
I mean, in a facility.
Right. So I'm just saying that would be an unintended consequence of the wording we were really careful about.
I support that. I don't want that to happen.
But anyway, just something to think about.
My concern originally was, not knowing a lot about it, maybe there was some legitimate form of this that was considered an athletic event that would be taught at the judo studios or something like that, and that we didn't want Provo to be known as the place where this is not allowed, overly stringent, to just outlaw it completely. But if everyone agrees on what the definition of that MMA is, and if it is this kind of no holds barred, bare knuckle fighting, like we've seen on the links that Kay originally provided, I don't know that any of us would really want to argue that that's something that we approve of. And I think I'm moving more to the side where that is the kind of thing that we don't work with in Provo, and that there's probably not a good scenario that we could envision where we would accept it. Again, I was reluctant to have the council make some sort of an ordinance where everything is banned and we have some unintended consequences as a result, but I don't know if anybody can think of a situation where something like this would be appropriate in the city. In fact, if someone can,
it's difficult to say what that would mean be appropriate. That is to say, in the absence of polling data, how many families would need to opt to buy tickets to such an event at the convention center in order for us to say it's appropriate. It strikes me that the reason for keeping the ordinance as it is, given that it amended an existing policy, the council amended an existing policy at the request of the mayor, is that the phenomenon continues. Until you alerted us, I was unaware of that. It seemed to me that the ordinance had been, that is the amended ordinance, had been effective in largely doing away with what had happened initially 15 years ago. If that's not the case, then by all means, the mayor should be authorized to put a stop to such events. But what the county commission, in essence, is asking us to do through its director of the convention center is to explore a more diverse offering at that place that is the property of the county. We have no doubt hundreds of citizens of Provo who would welcome the opportunity to attend such an event were it held there. It is surpassing boxing nationally in terms of its popularity. It's something that one reads about in the sports pages in terms of the TV schedule for MMA. Were we to invite some MMA competitors, invite representatives of the state athletic commission to join us, we might be persuaded by their testimony that this is not barbaric in the way the YouTube footage suggests that it is. And there may be something to be said for exposure to controlled violence in this way. That is something therapeutic to be said about exposure to controlled violence. Now, even if all members of the municipal council find such a sport reprehensible, I think does not necessarily constitute warrant to prohibit access to it by all citizens. And rather than legislate morality, this strikes me as a fine case in which to allow the market to make the decision. That is, the county commission wants to experiment. We want to add just these 2 events a year into the mix of things to see if we can promote business and revenue at the convention center. My own inclination is to say, let's allow the experiment to happen and see what the community response is. It would certainly add to the cosmopolitanism of downtown Provo, something we seem to be seeking in view of the increasingly cosmopolitan visitors and population of downtown Provo.
You know, I empathize, I think, with a lot of those things. I think that some of those things make sense, and yet I still wonder, you know, there's so many things that can provide a public benefit. Nevada, for example, having gambling income pay for the taxes, the personal income taxes, and the amount that goes to public education as a result of that. To me, it's not worth it, even though there is some public benefit that derives to have those kinds of things. And I know there's a line somewhere in Provo. You know, if it were my constituents who wanted to attend that kind of a thing, I would probably think about it differently than how I'm imagining it, but this is an event that's advertised all over, and people come into the area because they want this kind of a thing. And it's not that, you know, we asked the police, we wanted to check and see what kind of an environment is it when the UCCU Center, UVU, holds an event like this. I don't know that we ever got the results back. Does it lead to an increase in crime? Is there, you know, are there problems that we would need to be concerned about when something like that happens? My gut feeling is I suspect that there probably would be, but I haven't heard anything about that. And at some point, I do think we have to legislate morality. You know, what is it that we want in our community? What do we think makes, what is a good cosmopolitan? What is bad cosmopolitan? What do we want to try to bring in and be the new face of Provo as we kind of rebuild our reputation from what it has been for many years in the past? I guess those are my concerns.
And I'm merely suggesting that we allow the market
To decide.
to a large extent make those kinds of carving at the joint.
as always, you make an articulate case for that point of view, but I was thinking about if we let the market decide, if we base our decision on what kinds of activities could we find several hundred residents that would want to attend, I can imagine lots of activities that we might want to experiment with. And to me, that would head us in a direction where Provo is like every other city across the country. And I think we would lose some of the standards and cultural things that make us unique. So I had to go back, like Mr. has mentioned, and ask my constituents how they felt about it. At least on my emails, it wasn't close. It was a very distinct supermajority that felt that this wasn't a compatible activity, and so I feel like I should respect that.
I wasn't suggesting that that this be libertine and that anything goes, because it is regulated after all by the state. As it is gambling.
I also haven't seen the demand for this yet. I don't like the idea of saying, no, you can't do this. I think it's still available to people if they want to participate in this. But as far as promoting it as a city or a county, I don't know that our constituency is quite ready for that yet. I think they still have the opportunity. There's a lot of good values that you can learn from this. For a few that I'm not sure I want my son to learn. But on the other hand, I think I've talked with some great people who it's increased their ability for health. They're quicker, they're stronger, they're faster. There's a lot of good values that can come from it, but I see some negative opportunities that my constituency isn't quite ready to accept yet. So that's my leanings at this point. So I just hope that those that want to participate can do so in a safe way. And I don't necessarily want to ban them from doing it here. But I am concerned about what Kim mentions also. I've seen that happen, and it is a very sad situation when it's uncontrolled. So,
is there any further discussion?
I just wanted to say too that I have a friend who opened up a gym in Aurora, an MMA training gym, and I went to the gym and she participated in some of it, and I didn't get it. I don't know, personally I didn't get it, but I think it's fine for them to have a gym and to train and to do all that. And like you say, to get in shape, and I get all that, but I don't understand the fighting aspect of it. I don't understand it for women, and maybe that's legislating morality, and maybe that's what you're trying to get at. But when I think about the end result of having this event where children are coming with their families, you can't watch violence and have it not affect you. Whether it's controlled violence, however it's shown to you, you can't watch violence and not have it affect you somehow. And to tell a child that we're going to pay and we're going to go as a family to watch this event, but don't you dare do that at school, and don't do that, at home, and don't do that. That's how children learn. They model behavior. It's more important what they see rather than what they hear in a lot of ways, because they model behavior. You're a psychologist, you probably know a lot more than this. But just in raising children and working at the school with children, and knowing all the programs that are in place to try to get kids to not fight and to not bully and to not have these types of things that are starting to happen again in Utah Valley amongst our high school. It's only a matter of time before it trickles down, to the younger grades too. And I just feel like I don't think that the constituents that I've talked to, I haven't had anybody say they would love it yet. I haven't had anybody say that they want it here. And so I'm just not seeing the need from my constituents or the desire to have it. And I find it very concerning personally. So anyway, and to separate my moral fiber from my judgment, I guess I can't do that.
Right.
So
I appreciate that. I appreciate what Gary said about his son. But I think I was not elected to establish policy for the citizens of the community based on my relation with my children.
But you were elected because people knew the person that you were. and that trusted in you
That may
to,
be, but it's not that I'm making a decision based on what I think it should be for my family. I
Right.
wouldn't do that.
right, and it's bigger than that. We're basing it on the health and safety and welfare of the people of Provo. Right, and that's more where I'm coming at it. I have my own personal experience, I also have the school experience, but I also have the nurse experience as a medical person. And then I come from the experience of the health and welfare and safety of our constituents in all of Provo. And that's where I have a hard time thinking that this, in any way, shape, or form, this helps move that along, or helps in any way
Again, but
the
but
health,
my
safety, or
personal
welfare.
difficulty imagining how this could is not necessarily germane to the issue of policy. It should be database to the fullest possible extent, evidence-based. And your statement about you can't help but be more violent by being exposed to violence, the evidence doesn't support that.
There's no evidence that supports it. Watching violence.
Isn't that there isn't? It depends on the context, the circumstances, not just exposure to violence, but exposure to violence in a context. That's what makes the difference.
I need some time to research that one.
There's a good deal of it there.
Mr. Chair, I just asked a question, Brian. Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Given some of the expressions that have been made, I think there's probably an expression of not desiring this. Where do we go from now? We've got an ordinance before us
Right.
that has been amended, so what, to get these opinions, either supporting an ordinance or changing an ordinance, or what is the next step, or what is the direction that can be taken?
Well, that's an excellent question, and I think the next step is either no action, if there can be no agreement, in which case the current ordinance stays in place, which already bans, which already invokes a ban, other than this ambiguity about the word events. Or some coalescing of opinion now. So I think what it would take is for someone to make a motion to either table the matter for a future debate and discussion, or to continue the matter to give some time to process things, or for someone to make a motion for a certain option to be brought back to the council. And as I mentioned before, those options could be passing the ordinance that was proposed that would allow MMA fights. The motion could be to leave the ordinance as is. The motion could be to not add new exceptions, but to remove the exception for city property, since that was one of the things that was discussed. I'm not hearing, for me, as far as for attempting to figure out how to draft something, I'm not hearing a lot of discussion or agreement about any new exceptions that would be added. So it sounds more like the issue is whether or not to remove exceptions that are currently there, or leave things kind of status quo, or there is an argument being made to go ahead and add the new exception for the state approved.
So the ordinance that is before us right now is the one that changes it to an event that's been approved by the state.
Correct.
That's the motion that's there.
Yeah, the one that was drafted did three things. It removed the exception for city property that was under the mayor's jurisdiction. It added an exception for events sanctioned by the state commission, and it removed that word, that events word at the end of the other exemption, just to clarify that that wasn't an other exception. And those are the three things that the current draft does.
Okay, so if we take this ordinance before us, somebody asks for a vote, and we vote against this ordinance, then we're back to the original ordinance that exists now that bans, I don't know, that's probably not the right word, but doesn't allow any fights.
And because we're in work session, and because of the way this happened last time, I don't think that ordinance is actually in front of you. What's in front of you right now is for someone to make a motion to say, this is what I want to do. And so one of the motions might be For instance, based on the arguments that he's been making, Chair Miller might make a motion to move that ordinance to a future council meeting for adoption. Or someone might make a motion to staff to do away with that one and come back to a future council meeting with an ordinance that removes the city exemption and deletes the word events, but otherwise leaves the ban in place. Those seem to kind of be the two most likely scenarios, the arguments that I've heard, that there could be other options. But the motion to be made here would be direction to staff as to what to bring back to a future council meeting.
Okay. I was a little confused last time. I think the motion I voted on had a different effect than what I thought it was going to have, so I think I'm with Mr. Van Buren on wanting to make sure we define clearly what we're doing here, but I felt like the intent of at least some of us was to say that we want to reject the proposal. But then there was kind of a side conversation of, is there something in the existing ordinance that we want to change? So I wonder if it would help to separate those two things and just have a motion on whether we want to reject the proposal. And then
Well, I think you're right. I don't mean to disagree with that. I think my view was that the current proposal was rejected at the last meeting. What I'm attempting to say here is that doesn't mean that it couldn't be resurrected. Sure. Right, but I think that proposal was, my recollection is that proposal was essentially voted down. And there was direction to staff to come back and say, if we were going to add an exception, what are the possibilities that exception could be, which is what I attempted to do. But now that I've done that, the floor is wide open again for the members of the council to say, let's go back to what we had, let's go forward with something new. I hope that doesn't confuse things more.
So I guess my intent, I'm not quite ready to make a motion because I want to make sure I get this right. My intent would be, let's reject the proposal and so it doesn't come back unless some future council decides to bring it back.
I just want to, again, just make sure, according to what you just said then, Brian, if we voted now to table this item, given what we did in the last meeting, this proposed new ordinance then is gone.
Right.
And
what you're left with is
it might come up again, and maybe there's but what the people at the county know and understand that.
Yeah.
That
Ryan's not
And
even.
they pretty much know that now. You just didn't. I mean, the motion was to.
we just didn't have a vote to yes or no on that ordinance. It seemed like it got really confusing. I don't want anybody else to be confused.
Right.
You know.
Yeah, but 6 of the 7 council members expressed their opinion of not wanting to allow it. So I think the county got that idea. It's just that in the meeting, as we went back and listened to it, there was discussion about, well, we still don't like the ordinance as written, so let's come back with some ideas.
And Mr. Buren, just as a point of procedural rules, to be clear about something, a proposed ordinance never has to be formally rejected. Any ordinance that ever comes before you, one of the appropriate ways of handling that would be just to vote to table it, and that means it's dead. So that is certainly one acceptable way of handling it.
So, if I were to make a motion, it would be that we would actually have direct staff to prepare an amendment to the ordinance that strikes the exception language and also strikes the word events.
By the exception language, you mean the
Exception language meaning for the mayor has the opportunity to have a city event and they need headgear and they need a medical.
Strike all of that out, but leave the educational institutions and the businesses that are doing
Correct.
construction.
So those they can still do their construction. It won't affect them. But as far as having an exception to that and having an event somewhere, that we just strike that language and then strike events, because that would prevent then an MMA event in Provo, which sounds like most of the council is kind of leaning that way. So that would be my motion, to direct staff to. But you already have a motion? Was that a motion?
No,
you made?
I made a motion, but I was just asking if I could clarify
Okay.
what that
Let me
is.
ask Ms. Jorgensen if she has. that motion.
No, I don't have that one clear because I didn't know it was going to be.
Because I said if I were to make a motion.
I have just made.
Sorry.
Excuse me.
Okay, so here's where my confusion is on that approach. I got pretty clear feedback from my constituents about the MMA, but most of them didn't really talk too much or say much about the boxing side of it. So I don't feel like I can really assume how they feel about whether we need to change the existing ordinance as it relates to boxing events.
Well, and I guess what I would say is that I think the proposal that Ms. Santiago has made doesn't affect the boxing, because the boxing is already banned. And so all she's proposing, as I understand it, is to say, well, this language that nobody really likes, not even the mayor, about the mayor being able to authorize it on city property, let's get rid of that, because it's awkward and confusing and nobody wants it there. So let's get rid of that, and let's delete this word events that could be misconstrued by somebody when it seems like the intent of the ordinance is clearly just to talk about instruction or education. Let's get rid of those and otherwise leave everything as it currently is.
Is that your motion?
Yes.
Mr. Chair.
Ms. Jorgensen, you have.
I've got
Okay.
And isn't that the resolution if we just strike the red?
Yes.
And take out the word.
Well, those are already crossed out.
Yeah.
Yes.
So those are all crossed out, we added the red.
If you
So
leave
we're
the
saying
strike through,
leave the strike
and
and
delete the insertion.
take the red out.
Yes.
Is that the
And the word events.
Yeah, it was already
Oh,
struck.
it's already struck. Okay, sorry, I right in front of
You
me.
take the current version, you leave all the strike-throughs and get rid of the, see, this is where I got us in trouble last time, because I talked about deleting strike-throughs and. Which are ours.
Don't start again.
Yeah.
In fact, let's ask Mr. Parker if this seems acceptable.
I believe so. Yeah. Just trying to look through the language, trying to think of anything that could be a problem, but don't see anything off the top of my head.
Is there a second?
Can I ask a question, or do you want to guess for the second one?
Please.
As I've looked at, and this has really made me mess things up, but as I look at boxing and MMA, I see those as two completely different sports. As I've studied both of those, is this banning boxing as well?
It's already banned, so the current
It's already
ordinance,
banned.
the current ordinance says fighting/boxing.
Is this the only place in our ordinance that it says boxing? Is the reason that it's banned because it says it here?
Yes.
I just look at, I haven't been to the academy and seen how they do their boxing events, and that is not MMA in my mind. I've seen those things, and they're,
Well, they're probably not banned if you're seeing them.
I mean, at the academy, at the military academy.
Oh.
And,
It's for a kid in kickboxing.
and boxing, yeah, I see it as a completely different event, but I don't know that we have that demand here in our community yet, but in my mind, boxing is not, the end goals are not the same as they are in the MMA.
I'm curious about the thoughts of the council members, because I'm not a fan of boxing either, but I could see maybe deleting that /boxing to see if eventually there is a market demand for something like that in our area. That's what my point is.
I think we're going down the road again to a few weeks ago. And I'm saying, we're trying to do two things with it. If we want to change the existing ordinance regarding boxing, let's come back with a proposal and say, but what we're doing is putting off the other to work out some bugs on boxing, and I don't know that
Well, I
that's.
think sorry.
That's only.
I'm just thinking that would be a discussion that we would still have in the future, but if we delete that, if we include that as a strike-through, we're opening ourselves to say that, yes, we are prohibiting MMA fighting, but we are opening the door to boxing. We could have an ordinance that might allow that. At least we're not prohibiting it specifically.
So if these groups that are getting together are using boxing gloves,
Well, yeah, so that's the potential, the one potential downfall is by deleting that word entirely from the ordinance, you're opening it up to any boxing, no matter how informal. So rather than doing that, then there would probably be, maybe a better option would be to go back and add an exception. And Ryan, do you remember, does PSWAC?
Mr. Jones, maybe I can add a clarification that will fix this though, because the events that I've been to, even when I watch them at the military academies, those have to do with instruction.
Right.
And so as they're coming in, they're teaching technique, they're teaching different things, and so maybe that is covered in the exception.
Boxing instruction.
Yeah, boxing instruction, because maybe that'll take care of that for me.
Well, the academy would be covered by the educational institution.
Exactly.
So we have a motion and a second. Mr. Van Buren, any further discussion?
There were two approaches mentioned there. Could you just clarify which of the two we're taking with the motion?
the motion was to strike the exception language where it talks about the mayor holding another event and having to wear headgear and having medical personnel, so all of that language that is still, that would be struck. And then the events, the word events would be struck.
Okay, so
As
just,
it is currently.
From the current ordinance. And then, yeah,
And then striking this language about the Pete Swasso Utah Athletic
well, that was
Association.
a recommended one, so that, yeah, we take that out too, because that's not part of the
The two descriptions are identical, but they're different ways of describing it. Ms. Santiago has described it as if we were starting afresh, and Mr. Van Buren has pointed out that if we take the paragraph about the Pete Swasso Athletic Commission out of the current ordinance, it already does everything that she said, which is true.
So I can change my ordinance to say that. Take out the Pete
So I
Swasso
view those as being the
paragraph.
same motion. That
Yeah,
You're
it's
gonna,
just-
you're gonna get back an ordinance that strikes out all of all the subparagraphs under paragraph 1, and strikes out the words or events in subparagraph 2, and does not include a new paragraph about the Pete Swasso Athletic Commission.
Maintains the strikes throughs and
That's right.
okay, so just to make sure that I'm understanding it, so so there would be no MMA, and in reference to boxing, we're leaving that alone except for 2 specific points, clarifying that the word events, so it's instructional only, and then we're taking out the part about the mayor being able to authorize these exceptions, and the mayor has said he's okay with that. Is that right? Okay. So,
Just to ask Brian, in subsection 2, I'm looking at the draft ordinance 63 to 65. As I'm reading that number, does the "nor" need to get put back in to make that more clear, since you only have 2 choices now instead of 3?
Yes.
On line 64. Now, let me just ask a hypothetical question. Let's assume for a minute that Provo High School, even though they have no boxing program, decides to host in their auditorium a boxing exhibition, bringing a couple of Olympic boxers to hold an exhibition. The way I'm reading this is that would be authorized under the code, even if it's not necessarily for instruction, but because it's an educational institution holding an activity.
Right.
Is that the way you read that?
I agree, because the way it's currently structured, the two exceptions are this: any activity or class sponsored by an educational institution. So if a school is sponsoring it, any activity is fine. It doesn't define the purpose of the activity.
So
And then the second exception is, if you're a business, the purpose has to be for instruction.
Okay.
That's the way it's
I just want to make sure that's, because I could see a host of scenarios coming up here that just want to make sure I recognize that's what your intent is, what the council's intent would be with that language.
One more clarification then, as we vote on this, we're just voting to bring it to a council meeting.
Next Tuesday, correct. That's correct.
And then we'll have that written right in front of us, and we can, okay.
That's right. We need to start all over again. So, all in favor? Motion? Any opposed? That passes unanimously.
We're going to 5-minute recess. Louise had over. But it's very portable, it's been fun.
Great. We'll break for 5 minutes for dinner to be served, and then we're going to switch item 4 with item 3. And, Mr. Sandberg is here and prepared to make this presentation. So, in 5 minutes' time, proceed with that.
Thanks for asking this question. Well, DRC stuff. Yeah, this is something that's all the time.
There's a lot of information in there.
Everybody expecting that somebody.
The more black and white it is, to get a.
I was across the street. I Yes, how the boards are.
Structured, but. No, it's just, two-sided. I'm more excited about my dad.
But if you could establish.
Okay.
Maybe it's.
So you do have a flat tire. I got on the bus down, front on the train rather than southbound. About 15 minutes off schedule there. I just went to Woods Cross. So I back to Salt Lake. Got off, southbound, but during the afternoon, it's an hour, it's like, it's like morning.
That's right.
I figured the train. The train was on the west tracks when I got off, so I figured the train on the west tracks when I got. Yeah, I was confused, obviously. So, in my mind, I got off that train, therefore I should get back on that train.
They're building where they're building.
Well, I would almost wish that I could step on campus and go high school.
I can assure you the.
So they can show
Does this little sucker about 30% battery from my phone?
So, save you for the rest of the day. So, it didn't have internet at the station, so I can wipe my phone out. You might have one school, no, it's just a little, solar charge. Battery, extra battery. We started less on the phone now. And this is things that. You're always adjusting class. I don't know. No, I did purchase Chromecast.
Anytime you guys get to
Experiment with the TV, and it's worth $35.
See if I'm catching this.
We're not cars, we're following the speed of whether they just have the laptop in the issue.
I think it's trying to evaluate something that's not possibly but every building should be a good representation of the town as well. But it can still be respectful. Kind of keep the same materials, the same height, the same pacing, the same number of doors, first block. But it shouldn't look like it was built 100 years ago. It's in 100 years. There's no base.
At the edge of where there's one of the board members that was just involved with
What about things like
the central bank. He says that's on our campus on the energy department to look like, so that we're keeping that flavor of Provo. And I said, okay, that's what we want to do here. So you want the new buildings maybe to reflect
the same side house, and they'll just read it.
Good example. In fact, that's what all the buildings in downtown are. Everybody was trying to build the most modern, contemporary thing they could possibly do. To show that we were a contemporary place.
new skid that are later.
Well, the dark painted building was much better, but it was small, so much taller. It's not a building. It's so much that there's no textures, there's no appreciation for what's going on. Yes, it still looks contemporary, but the height, they've got some nice textures, so people walking on the
You're trying to estimate the crowd, it's about 2 minutes.
Once they get down, if there's
Some 75 chairs, 3 times.
can't just campus over.
So we want that's hard to comments and
To the.
but then these other rules were mostly unused, so.
You know, they had some concepts of trying to call them.
We look also ensuring kids are back home.
Sometime maybe.
The crash of the generation. Gets all us.
I guess that's the story behind it.
During the life of the city of modern art. People try to see it. They can watch it. We didn't do it. We had it over at the century.
It's interesting.
The old science where it was.
George mentioned it, and just see if he would like you to come. He needs to get spending, so I think he'd be really interested.
We resume with Ms. Santiago excused for a discussion on a request for a zoning map amendment of approximately .8857. That's approximately .8857. Literally located at 1600 North, 900 East, R18. One-family residential zone to PF, public facility zone, in order to build a new auxiliary laundry facility for BYU.
Thank you. Is it better for me to stand here or to? Does it matter? Let me give you a little bit of overall context here. If we go to the first slide that shows the map. Many of you are aware of the MTC's plans to expand to the south. And that's the reason why BYU is here looking to move 2 buildings, a laundry facility that currently sits here, and an auxiliary maintenance building that sits here at the corner of University Parkway and 9th East. The MTC announced, and I think several of the council members were there, that their plans are for their current campus right here to expand to the south, right there along the University Parkway. And in order to meet the request from the MTC to vacate this land that BYU has had, we had several constraints that I think would be nice for the council to be aware of. One of them was the laundry building actually serves a significant amount of the MTC population, and a significant amount of the MTC's work is for the MTC. So we needed to keep the laundry building relatively close to the MTC. That was one criteria. Another criteria was that we wanted to be able to, as we looked at places nearby, we selected an area here just inside the intersection. This is Quad 7 of Wymount. We also wanted to maintain as much of our current BYU operations as we have. So in Wymount Terrace, we have many married student housing facilities. Each, I should not say all these quads, some of the quads, like this one, have 72 residences. And so we wanted to take down as few residences as possible as we put these in. And the other thing we wanted to do was to maintain safety among these facilities and the student and young children population here, as well as one final consideration. This is a church building here on 9th East. It was built decades ago by the Wasatch and Oak Hills neighborhood. They used to use it as a residential, family neighborhood chapel, and for that reason, they had an access through Fur Avenue into the parking lot. As that church has been used now for young single adults and for married students, and no longer by this neighborhood, the neighborhood has put in some Jersey barriers here so that the parking lot is no longer accessible from the neighborhood. But there is still a need for parking here that the neighborhood doesn't want to spill in to their streets. And so there are 144 stalls currently north of the chapel and in kind of an elongated, sort of triangular shaped area here. And in our design, we wanted to maintain that same parking space so that on Sundays, there's still the same parking space for church use. So we go to the next slide. What we're asking for is for this very approximate rough 0.85, as Hal mentioned. What we would like is for this triangle here to be rezoned from residential to public facility. We're not asking for anything south of here, which is the church building, to be zoned to public facility. And that was in part because of our conversation with the Wasatch neighborhood. They were concerned that if we zoned the whole thing public facility, that would allow, potential buildings there. BYU is not going to own any of the property south of this line, and so it's completely up to the church and its agents to talk through whether they'll keep that as a church in the near future, which we had fully anticipated doing. And also this parking will all be for the church-related functions. The reason we needed to get this rezoned public facilities is we cannot build a building that crosses different zoning types. As part of what we're doing this with the church, they will be actually creating a new subdivision of this area, dividing it in half, and then deeding to BYU this section just north of the church there. So that's a little bit of context about the area. As we go to the next slide, this is the current residential zone. So you've seen the part that we were asking to have come up. It's because you may wonder why the parking lot is already partially zoned public facility. Decades ago, 9th East used to curve straight up to the temple. And it's only been in the last several decades that this intersection has been squared off, that different property has been vacated by the city and given back to the church and to BYU for that area there. But this used to be the way the road curved up. There was an old neighborhood. The MTC currently sits in an old orchard, the Beeston property. The MTC parking lot that many of you know used to be a subdivision. So this is part of the, as Provo has grown and matured, we have had changes, and I anticipate fully this will be here, in future months, talking about other kind of minor changes this way about how both the MTC, BYU, and the surrounding communities are going to continue to grow and progress. So in the general map, if you go to the next slide, anticipates that this would all be zoned public facilities. So this doesn't require a general map amendment. But the city council can take note that this section here, even though the general plan anticipates that someday that might be public facilities, we're not asking for that now. And again, because the church owns this section with the church, I have no plans for that in the near future or even in the intermediate future. Go to the next slide. Our design takes in this entire area here. This is quad 7, as I mentioned. The students will have moved out of that area by May 1st. We've been able to accommodate all of them who hadn't already graduated with Wynmount housing and other units if they wanted that, or if they wanted to move to other married student housing, they were given that option too. This quad would be demolished, and in this area, we will now place the 2 buildings that we showed in the previous map, the laundry and the auxiliary maintenance. Go to the next slide. Going back to the 3 design criteria we're looking for. 1, a safe perimeter. This auxiliary maintenance building really doesn't have a function that anyone from the general public, or really anyone from BYU other than the maintenance people, have any access to. So there's a fence right here, and a fence right here, and all of this area is kind of back of house area. It's the loading docks, it's where the trucks come in and drop off the materials. We've designed it in a way that anyone driving along 9th East University Parkway wouldn't even see that area. It's all kind of hidden up behind. We've also, and this is something that as I've met with the different neighborhood chairs, I met with Paul Evans, even though he's not his neighborhood, he likes to talk about these things. But I met with Melissa Kimball, and who does have a particular interest in this, and their main concern was that Fur Avenue not be opened up to traffic in and out, and it won't be, and also that any building wouldn't affect their backyards unless we were to talk through what was going on. And as you can see here, the current Wynmount Terrace building will stay where it is. All of this construction is kind of internal to BYU's own property or north of the existing meeting house. The parking that we showed before kind of comes up in this area. We have been able to maintain 144 stalls through this area and including that section, so that as the church needs that parking, they've got it. And the last piece too is that we have made it so that there will be both fencing and landscaping that will protect both from view and for safety reasons all of these functions here. And the next slide shows, again, this is just the area that we're asking to be rezoned so that we can build the auxiliary maintenance. That will be the laundry building. And then the last slide, just to show you the elevations. The elevations have been uniformly well received by the design review committee, by all the neighborhoods. This will match in brick palette and in architecture style the heritage halls that we've been building on the other side of 9th East. And as we expanded the intersection and gave land to Provo City to, as you make a right-hand turn coming up east on University Parkway and then turn right on 900 East, we had to move our fence back in around the Harmon building. That has all been done in the same red brick palette too. So as far as tying it all into the campus, we feel like this architecture and the coloring and style will make a nice complementary scheme to all of campus. And this is what you will see as you drive along up 9th East. If you were driving north towards the MTC and towards Mount Timothyus, and you look off to your right, this is what you would see in place of where the current parking lot is. And we think that this building makes it a nice look. It doesn't call out and say it's an industrial laundry building, which it happens to be inside, but it does look pretty nice. And then the next slides show the other elevations to the west and to the south. We're bricking the entire building. We won't just have like one facade that looks nice and the other one's more industrial. Both buildings will have all those same elevations. If there are any other questions for the council on this, any concerns about rezoning?
So quadrant 6 then was really left in place as a buffer, kind of buffer between the project and the neighborhood.
And also just because we have a lot of married students who want to live close to campus. So in addition, the reason why we tore down 7 instead of 6, you're right, was to have a buffer to the neighborhood. But we wanted to try to design it in a way that we could keep as much residential housing as we can. And that's why we have quad 6 still up. And we're grateful to the church for allowing us to tinker with their parking lot in order to make this happen.
Questions, Mr. Senator?
Looks good.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like Mr. McGinn or Mr. Pepperoni to weigh in.
I went to the design review committee this afternoon, and they were very complimentary.
And this would come to the council meeting on
May 20th.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We now turn to Mr. Harvey for discussion overview, rather, of various bonding mechanisms. This word bonding refers to financial bonds.
Thank you, Chair Miller, members of council. I will make this quick because you don't probably want to get home to your families. Just a quick overview. The reason we put this on the agenda is council staff met and talked about upcoming agendas in the budget that's coming up. In recent discussions that the council has had, we thought it pertinent to talk a little bit about bonding mechanisms. What are the different bonding mechanisms that are available to council, and really what are the differences between the bonding mechanisms, especially between a general obligation bond and a revenue bond. Sometimes we just say bonding, and maybe someone's talking about a revenue bond when it's really a general obligation bond. So we just wanted to have a brief discussion about that, the difference between that. So as the council continues to have these discussions over the next few months and years, that we differentiate what we're really talking about. Just a little background. As you can see here, this is a presentation that was done by Zions Bank, and it has some good information. And I'm also taking a lot of the information from a publication by ULCT called Making Sense of Dollars. And we're going to try to get a publication for each of the council members. But it has a lot of good information in there. You can just kind of see a bond agreement between a lender and a borrower. Just a little bit of information. The amount of the loan is called the principal amount or face value. Talks a little bit about what the maturity date is, the coupon rate. Bryce, if you go to the next slide. And then what is tax-exempt financing? It kind of talks a little bit about the benefits to the city. The federal government cannot tax states, and individual states do not tax themselves. Investors who buy tax-exempt bonds do not pay taxes on interest they earn, so they're willing to accept lower interest rates. So that's the benefit to the city. That's why we get lower interest rates. Just a little bit of the brief history. If you go to the next slide, we'll just skip through we'll skip past this one. This just kind of talks about how it's trending more and more over the past 100 years. If you go to the next one, and just go to the next slide. So this is a little graph, and we'll kind of go through. I'll go through this graph briefly. There's different ways to finance projects when a project comes up. Recently, we've had discussion about, do we want to do pay-as-you-go, or do we want to go into debt to get a project? And this graph kind of talks about some of the positives and negatives of the different approaches. So 4 approaches for financing capital projects: pay-as-you-go, save up and set aside revenue, grants and loans, and then debt financing. You can see the positives: interest is earned. That's the save up and set aside. You're earning money on that interest. No interest is paid when you have pay-as-you-go and save up and set aside. Usually when we say we want to do pay-as-you-go, that's the biggest benefit. We don't have to pay interest. The benefits of grants and loans and debt financing is that those who use the project pay for it, and then the project is completed immediately. The negatives, so the negatives of the first 2 are you have a long wait time, and you have risk of inflation costs. The positives of debt financing, or the negatives of debt financing, is it requires interest payment, which is usually the biggest negative that is cited for going into debt. And then for grants and loans, possible conditions for use, arduous qualification process, and that's just inherent in grants and loans. If you go to the next slide, Bryce, this is kind of what we wanted to get to. The difference between a general obligation bond and a revenue bond. And this is good for council members, good for the citizens. As we talk about bond financing, it's really important to note the difference between the two and how the city has used this. This graph's really good, so we'll just talk about the top two, and if you have further questions about the other ones, we can go into that. But general obligation bonds is paid, the way you pay it, the way that it's secured is by property tax. The general obligation bonds that we have as a city currently is you have the recreation center. That was a general obligation bond. General obligation bonds, as it says, required authorization has to be 50% vote of the citizens. That was approved by the citizens. You also have the 2006 road bond that was approved, and then you have library improvements that was approved as well. So those are the GO bonds that the city currently has. So you have property tax. It can be used for many types of projects, and the city, the legal debt limit for the city is actually 4%. So just so as a comparison, it's 4% of market value. And I'm getting this number from last year's budget book, which we'll get some new numbers here next week when we get the new budget book. But so for the 2012 valuation of the city was $4.1 billion. The total legal debt limit is $165 million. The current debt that we have, GO bonds, is $42 million. So we're at about 25%, 26% of the total that we're allowed. Right? So we still have a lot of allowable general obligation debt that you could go into. Then you go to revenue bonds. Revenue bonds, and this is what we were talking about in last work session when Public Works came in and talked about the bonding that they were going to do. That was revenue bonds. And the way that you pay for those is from whatever the enterprise is that wants to bond. And so lots of the bonding that we've talked about as a council, that the administration has come and brought before the council, have been revenue bonds. And one thing that's really interesting, well, first of all, the required authorization is city council. You don't have to go to the public for that. And the project has to be related to the revenue source that's being pledged. But what was interesting is it's the capacity is 1.5 times the coverage. So essentially what that means is you have to have the ability to pay the bond plus 25% of that. And so you can go into as there's not like a specific number, but as long as you're willing to raise the rates to cover the 1.25, then you can go into that amount. So that's a question that is, as the administration comes and maybe proposes a revenue bond for water or for any of the enterprise that we have, is to talk about how much are we going to have to raise those rates to get to the 1.25, and they may not have to raise them that much, but that's the question that we need to be asked.
Ryan, can I ask you a question about this? I know that, for example, I'm just a little curious how this Provo bill worked then, because that was a revenue bond, but
it's the next one down.
Okay. Thank you. Well, wait a minute. Hold up on my question.
Well, you can go ahead now. I wasn't going to go into the rest of these, but there are these other kind of bonds, which is excise tax, franchise tax. That's the one that's in this category. But it's the same thing. Authorization from City Council determined by you have to have 1.25 times the coverage.
Wayne, but maybe what's the key difference there in that revenue bond versus the franchise tax?
Well, the revenue bonds are based on, the best analogy I'd give you would be like a business going out and borrowing money. The bank, your lenders are going to look at your revenue stream associated with that particular line of business and decide what your creditworthiness is. And they will fix an interest rate based on your creditworthiness. So the only thing you're obligated to repay on a revenue bond is based on the revenues from that function. So for example, if the city were to bond to build a water tank, as an example, the only thing we pledge are water system revenues. So if we default on that, the bondholders can't come back and take sales tax or property tax. The only access they have is to water fund revenues. And so it's a very business-like debt. And it's based on the revenues associated with that business. So if it's the cemetery, for example, which you'll be talking about next week, the only revenues we're pledging are revenues associated with the sale of cemetery lots. The excise tax revenue bonds are bonds that are based on a city's taxing authority that have nothing to do with property tax. So property tax is out of the picture, but sales tax, franchise tax, other taxing type sources are available for these excise tax revenue bonds. And so we've done, the iProvo bonds were done in that way. They are still that way. Even though we now have a utility fee that's used to repay those bonds, if we were ever to default, the bondholders will first claim in our sales tax revenue, not anything else. And so yeah, and we did that basically because it was a significantly lower interest rate than making any other choice, and it made the project feasible to do. So if we wanted, for example, to bond against the utility and transportation fee, that would fall into that excise tax revenue. It's not an enterprise fund, so it's not a truly dedicated revenue source. It's one source among many. And so if you wanted to do that, that would be an option. But so we've used all of those. Revenue bonds, we currently have revenue bonds outstanding in the energy fund. Those will actually be paid off this fiscal year. We'll be done with all of those, and so the energy fund in and of itself will be out of debt this year. And so again, if you were to bond for improvements to the energy campus, that would be a revenue bond from the enterprise fund, would be only subject to those revenues.
So would we expect that the interest rate on the cemetery bonds, then revenue bonds, be higher necessarily since its access is so limited? Yes, it would probably be a little higher, again, because there's a little more risk associated with it. The upside, there's two upsides. One is we pledge 125% of annual bond coverage. We put that in an escrow account. When we pay the bond, 25% is released back. Next year, we have to put 125%. We pay the bond, that 25% is released back. And so the bondholders know at the beginning of every fiscal year that they've got a place to go get those dollars. Now, again, you could conceivably move those dollars, do something else with them, and default on the bond. They also bank on our good name, the fact that none of us want to default on a bond. And so we'll figure out what it takes to pay that, regardless of what the dedicated revenue source is. So, again, lease revenue bonds, just to highlight quickly, we use those as well. We use those for building the ice sheet. We created what's called Municipal Building Authority. We did a lease revenue bond. So the only thing, we essentially paid to the bondholders the value of the lease. So the city and the county both put money, signed a lease agreement with the Municipal Building Authority. Building Authority received those lease revenues and paid the bonds. And so, and again, those are paid off now. We don't have any current lease revenue bonds, but it's been a tool we've used before. Could be used in a variety of ways. Could be used for a city center or a public safety building, for example. Odds are you might want to do something that would generate, again, better interest rate than a lease revenue bond, but particularly for a multi-jurisdictional bond, it's a very common tool. Tax increment bonds, again, are really only based on tax increment generated by a redevelopment project. You'll notice that the market coverage is 2 to 3 times the annual bond payment, because if a business goes belly up and stops paying their property tax, you have no increment. And so you might have a cash challenge to pay those. It's a little higher risk, and so the bondholders require a higher level of security and charge a higher interest rate. And special assessment bonds, we've also used those. We still have some of those outstanding when we did the
what we call the SID. Several years ago, we did some improvements up in Carterville and built some curb gutter and sidewalk and roads in areas that needed them. Those are paid for by annual assessments. They're paid for by property owners, and then those proceeds are used to pay the bonds back. And so again, I think we've used, the city's used all of those tools at one time or another for debt financing.
When's that special assessment bond? That would be a particular area. You're going to some improvements this area, so we're going to.
That's right.
People in that area.
So if you went up into the tree streets and wanted to build sidewalks in areas where there haven't been sidewalks, you could charge the cost of that project to the property owners and break it out on a footage basis, for example. And then they would pay an annual assessment, and that assessment would be used to pay the bonds.
Voter approval is needed only for the general
Only
obligation.
for general obligation. Now, special assessments, there are some constraints around that. You must have much like the early business district we did for downtown Provo, there is a protest posture, and so if more than 50% protest, then it closes down the special assessment area. So there is, in that sense, there's kind of a vote, but it's basically an opt-out kind of vote instead of an opt-in.
How do you decide on the term of the bond? The length of,
I think that, generally speaking, our financial principles that we adopt as part of the budget suggest we bond for as limited a time as possible. You don't want to bond beyond the useful life of the facility, for example. You don't want to do a 50-year bond on a cemetery or a building necessarily, but the recreation center, I think it was 20, I can't remember if it's 15 or 20, but it's 20 road bonds we've done on 10-year increments. So again, it's largely a matter of, just your judgment at the time you issue them as to how long and what your repayment schedule is and can it fit within your existing revenue constraints.
It's easier to sell a little bit longer term than a real short one, though. Don't the bondholders like that?
Bondholders like long-term guaranteed investment. And so again, and you do get a different market. A 10-year bond will attract some kinds of investors. A 20-year bond will attract other kinds of investors. So, and that can drive the interest rate. As Ryan suggested, sometimes tax increment rates or tax-free rates, tax-exempt rates have been typically better than the commercial rates. Today, the market's upside down. We're actually better to sell taxable bonds right now. It's just an anomaly in the way the market is pricing bonding today. So again, we will, when you did the parameters resolution for the cemetery bond, you authorized our bond underwriters to choose the better option. So we may use tax-exempt financing, we may use taxable financing, depending on what generates the better interest rate. Sometimes bondholders, for example, will wish to have a little higher interest rate, and so they'll pay a premium on the bond. Well, that happened with the recreation center, and so they paid more than 100% of the value of the bond. And that's how we did a $39.5 million bond and came with $42 million in cash. Even though our debt service only covers the $39 million because the bondholders were successful, paid a premium to get that advantage in the interest rate. And so again, it's a mix of a lot of factors. And so when we go through that process of bond sale, we'll look at all those factors and come back with the most cost-effective way to do that. And you'll see that again next week. We'll be marketing the bonds for the cemetery on Tuesday morning next week, and so you'll see about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. We'll know exactly what that final bond parameter will be, and we'll bring that to you next Tuesday.
The transportation utility fund, is that anticipated as a pay-as-you-go thing, or is
yes, it is anticipated pay-as-you-go. We don't anticipate any bonding. There could at some point be a reason to do that, and that would be subject to a future city council's determination. But the way it was marketed and sold and the way we're budgeting for it today is entirely on a pay-as-you-go basis.
I had planned to ask Mr. Parker if there was anything that he
This is a great chart. This is I've seen this kind of thing used frequently. It's a very good summary of a whole lot of body of law.
Yeah. We're going to get this, right?
Yeah.
Mr.
I asked them if they had it available electronically, but they don't, so.
Could you get
We have to
that?
get physical copies.
Could you get that also for our budget committee? I'm sure Kim would like to have that.
Sure.
I think that would be a useful tool for us.
It's a $30 fee. If,
You're not getting copies.
Mr. Taylor.
Not a money.
One copy and you can check.
Yeah, I guess I can copy this, then
We'll get you copies.
ruin the copyright.
It's a very useful
It is a very-
document, it's several years old, but I think that
Yeah, they said they're doing an update, but.
still apply, but it's very user-friendly, it's very readable for a non-public finance expert.
Yeah.
Wishing you would
Really good chart.
I invite Mr. Taylor, Mr. Jones to add as they wish. Thank you very much. Mr. Harvey, well done. At this point, I invite a motion to adjourn.
So Saturday's budget meeting,
Thank you. So Thursday night's meeting is going to be canceled.
Got me meeting.
We did not get, well, a significant number of the planning commissioners going to attend. And so we'll send out one of those doodle requests with multiple options, looking for the optimal time to do that, probably on a Wednesday or Thursday evening again, but we'll give them several options, as well as yourself, so if you'll respond to that survey. Saturday, though, the administration has done a pretty good job, I think, as Wayne pointed out to leadership and myself earlier, bringing to you the issues as they've come up through their planning process and budget planning process, and so they don't have the tentative budget yet for your distribution, and they feel like every other issue has been covered up to date. And so Mr. Miller's asked me to go back, look at with my staff, and we'll put together an agenda for our review of the budget and report back to you sometime later in May.
No, there won't be a meeting set.
So that's a long way of saying no meeting Saturday.
and no meeting Thursday.
And no meeting Thursday. Now, a motion. Mr. Garrett, thank you. Mr. Tails, thank you. All in favor? That is unanimous with Ms. Santiago excused. Thank you very much.